A new DNA test developed by Queensland researchers could help identify the remains of some of the thousands of Australian soldiers who have been lying unidentified in battlefields across the Pacific since World War II. Tens of thousands of Australian soldiers fought the Japanese in the Asia-Pacific, and more than 70 years later, 5,000 soldiers still have no known grave. The remains of soldiers are still being found on Pacific battlefields, mainly in Papua New Guinea. Forensic biologist Dr. Kirsty Wright said the remains were highly degraded and identification was extremely challenging. When anthropologists recover bones from the ground after all of these years, they are literally falling apart in their hands, Dr. Wright said. Dr. Wright has decades of experience in victim identification. She had the grim task of identifying the victims killed in the 2002 Bali bombings and the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami in Thailand. Dr. Wright now leads a team at Brisbane's Genomic Research Centre, who developed a new DNA test to identify historical remains more accurately and reliably than current DNA testing methods. I've worked in criminal casework, missing persons and disaster victim identification for nearly 20 years now, but far and away the remains that we have to identify from World War II are so much more difficult because it's so long since they died, she said. There's not much evidence left, particularly the remains recovered in the Asia-Pacific. They've suffered the extreme environmental insult from the heat, the humidity, the rain and the bacteria from the soil. After finding human remains, she said the first step is to determine their ancestral origin. The new targeted DNA test can successfully predict Australian or Japanese ancestry in 79% more cases than current mitochondrial DNA testing methods, and can even identify hair and eye color. Dr. Wright said the S&P test, single nucleotide polymorphism, works in a very targeted way and was developed over 3 years by 2 PhD students, Andrew Geed and Kyle James. On the 2 meters of DNA that's found inside everyone's cells, we're really honing in on those little tiny pieces that are very different in the Japanese population and the Australian population of the World War II era, she said. We needed a test that had a really high degree of certainty because the last thing we want to do is make a mistake and accidentally send an Australian soldier to Japan or bury a Japanese soldier in a Commonwealth war grave. The stakes are pretty high and our tolerance for error is zero, and that's out of respect for both the Australian and Japanese soldiers. The Australian Defence Force will trial the new targeted DNA test on remains found recently in PNG. Andrew Burney leads a small team called Unrecovered War Casualties Army, UWC Army, that seeks to identify soldiers from historic battles. The remains that we have encountered in the last few years were found on the north coast of PNG, and they're being analyzed in Port Moresby at the moment, Mr. Burney said. This new test will allow us to identify them and in time allow us to return them to their families. Finding Lost Soldiers YouTube link. It has been almost 5 years since the Army last positively identified remains of Australian soldiers from World War II. Two commandos from the top-secret Z Force who were captured and killed during a reconnaissance mission off the north coast of Papua New Guinea in April 1945 were laid to rest in Port Moresby in 2014. The Army had spent years looking for their remains, finally discovering them on Kaiwiru Island in 2013. Remains found on the Kokoda track in 2011 were thought to be those of an Australian soldier killed in a fierce battle in 1942. More than 600 Australians were killed during 4 months of fighting along Kokoda, considered the most significant campaign fought by Australians during the war. There was a lot of souveniring during fighting, and this soldier was first thought to be Australian because he was wearing Australian boots, Mr. Burney said. Thankfully, through forensic testing we were able to identify him as a Japanese soldier and even identify who he was and his name, and return him appropriately to the Japanese authorities. Mr. Burney said the new DNA test would make the painstaking process of identifying remains easier. The research was funded by the Australian Army Research Centre and has attracted international interest. He said the Army maintained a deep commitment to providing closure for families who never knew what happened to their loved ones. The most important part of what we do is to make sure that we are resolving these long-standing challenges in families, he said. It is incredible to see how these unresolved losses and missing family members from 60, even 70 years ago, still have an impact on families and how affected they are when identifications can occur,